Dr. McMahon got her BA from Bryn Mawr and then came here, so she is not only one of our own because she is now our professor of Mesopotamian archaeology, but she also got her degree from here in 1995. In 1995, she moved to the UK, where she became a professor in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and last year she moved back. Professor McMahon has a wide archaeological field experience. She excavated in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Yemen. Among them, excavations that she directed at Chagar Bazar and Tel Brak in Syria and Lagash in southern Iraq. And she is now reviving for us the what is perhaps the flagship archaeological excavation of the Institute of ISAC, namely the Nippur excavations in Iraq. Professor McMahon has held visiting professorships in Paris, in Changchun, in China, and in Rome. She is very sought after for editorial and advisory boards in the field. She has 2 books to her name, plus 3 edited volumes, an enormous list of articles and chapters in books. And when I went through the list of her CV, I noticed that she has lectured in not only most European countries and in the Middle East, but also in China, India, Japan, Guatemala. I think the only continent I was missing was Australia, so you still need to go there. According to her own description, her research focuses on late prehistoric and historic Mesopotamia during the 5th through 1st millennia BC, particularly issues of early urbanism, which we will hear about tonight, and urban challenges, which we will hear about tonight, social stress and warfare, political economy, and what I personally find very exciting, sensory archaeology. I remember a talk that she gave here relatively recently on, I hope I'm saying it correctly, smellscapes and soundscapes in ancient Mesopotamian cities, which for me was entirely new and brought a whole new picture to the ancient Middle East and to modern archaeology. I hope we will hear something of that tonight. If not, we will have to invite you again. So tonight she will be speaking on affluent suburbs or disenfranchised banlieue, the urban edge at Nippur, Iraq. Please join me in welcoming Professor Augusta McMahon.
Thank you to Teo for the introduction, and to whoever the committee was for the invitation to give the Sumner Memorial Lecture. Thank you to John Alden for his support of the lecture in memory of his good friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Sumner. Thank you all for coming in person, and thank you anyone online for tuning in. So my presentation today will describe the upcoming research project at Nippur in Iraq and a behavioral ecology approach that I hope Bill Sumner would have approved of and enjoyed. But I want to begin with an anecdote about Bill Sumner. So my time as a PhD student at Chicago overlapped with Professor Sumner's appointment as the then OI director. But I only interacted with him really once, and that was during my PhD viva, which was a daunting process that at that time, maybe still does, involves any member of what was then the OI and NELC staff turning up and asking those difficult questions. So the day came and the room kind of filled up and colleagues asked their questions. All men, by the way, so that's different now. And when Bill's turn came, he thunders across the room. Why did you not use any statistics? So I mentally sort of flipped through some alternative answers and couldn't really think of anything, but was saved by Matt Gibson, who was sitting next to me, who flipped open his copy of my dissertation and pointed to various tables of relative percentages of pottery-type frequencies, which I had indeed included. So I burbled out something about, well, you know, if you'd read as far as page 130, you would have seen these tables, right? Blah, blah, blah. But anyway, eventually we moved on, right? The point of this anecdote is, in fact, that Bill's was really the only question that I remember from my viva. And actually the only one that I think I didn't actually answer particularly well with whatever that was. Right. So it says a great deal about Bill's capacity to focus in on a particular aspect of a project's archaeological method and to suggest room for improvement. So now I want to turn to the research project at Nippur. And one important part of this project will involve examination of the past movement of people and animals between Mesopotamia and Elam, or between the alluvial plains of the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau. And of course, Iran was where Dr. Sumner did most of his fieldwork and research. And my questions are about past urbanism. What happens when a settlement undergoes rapid urban growth, particularly top-down, government-led development? How does the nature of urban space change? And how do these changes affect the existing population? And what are the opportunities and challenges for newly arrived populations? Are modern concepts such as suburbs and urban sprawl appropriate to describe past urban settlements? And overall, what was the lived experience of urban power? So these research questions are particularly relevant for Nippur, which is in the center of the alluvial plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So if you don't know, Nippur was a religious center. It's home of the god Enlil, who was head of the enormous Mesopotamian pantheon of deities for most of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Nippur also had multiple temples to other deities, and the city was an important economic center as well, given its prime location amid all the irrigated fields and pasture lands between the two rivers, and also had access by river to enormous far-flung networks of both local and long-distance trade. Now, the main natural feature of Nippur is what's called the Shatanil, a former course of the Euphrates River, which runs right through the center and divides the site into eastern and western mounds. The settlement ultimately extends to approximately 130 hectares, and its maximum height is over 20 meters above the modern plain. Now, Google tells me, for those of you who aren't yet embracing the metric system, that that's about 320 acres and approximately 60 feet in height. So Nippur is occupied consistently from at least the 3rd millennium BCE Ubaid period, no, 5th millennium BCE Ubaid period, right through the Sasanian early Islamic period. But the settlement expanded and contracted over time, related to things like climate change and political regime change. And it only reaches 130 hectares in extent in some very specific political circumstances. So the main eastern and western mounds do appear to be occupied pretty consistently, but the southern area, that's down actually near the excavation house, was first occupied in the late 3rd millennium BCE and was episodically abandoned and reoccupied. Now, Nippur is extremely challenging to excavate, in part due to this very long history of occupation, and equally from its very long history of excavation as well, both of which essentially has radically altered the ancient mound. So this topographic map shows some of these challenges: the ancient stratigraphic accumulation and disturbances from past excavations are very difficult to sort of separate and pick apart. So I've just given you a little piece of it. So this complex situation is particularly acute on the eastern mound, which this detail shows. And here I've just outlined the largest piles of excavated soil from previous excavations, especially these long linear dumps that were created by hand-pushed rail cars that were used back in the days when the project hired hundreds of workers and excavated at an extremely large scale. There are a lot of other smaller excavation trenches and less obvious piles of excavated soil scattered around, which I haven't even bothered to outline for you, but you can see the problem that we're kind of up against. So the earliest excavations at Nippur that are responsible for most of these massive spoil heaps were directed by the University of Pennsylvania and lasted from 1888 to 1900. And they largely focused on exposing the ziggurat, or the temple tower of the god Enlil, which you can see here, and on the southern area of the East Mound, which they called Tablet Hill because of the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that they recovered there. Now, we now know that these tablets were from household archives, but the UPenn project in these very early years didn't identify their original contexts. Now, this early expedition also excavated some other buildings, such as the Parthian Court of Columns on the West Mound, also parts of the city wall, and a lot more. They had a habit of sort of digging around someplace exposing something for about 120 meters and then deciding that wasn't important enough and moving on. So this is the scale of some of these undocumented or underdocumented excavations that we have as well. Okay. So the University of Chicago engagement with the Nippur excavations then begins in 1948, and this phase of research focused again on the ziggurat in the temple to Enlil, but also on the adjacent temple to Inanna, who is the goddess of love and sex and one of the most important female deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. Excavation of these two temples was still at an enormous scale, but now actually used more careful methods and the principles of stratigraphic accumulation of occupation and stratigraphic excavation of those. The project recovered really important sequences of material culture, as well as many of the artifacts that are now in the ISAC Museum. And these include one of my favorites, and this has to be the top 10 of Mesopotamian statues on most people's lists, these distinctive foundation figures that represent the king of the Ur III period in his role as a builder. And they were buried near corners and doorways of buildings in order to protect the temple and ensure its longevity. This, by the way, is the current state of the Inanna Temple excavation, now pretty much completely filled with soil from erosion and other deposition. But you can see the ziggurat in the background and also some of these long linear rail car dumps from the 1890s as well, just so you get a sense of what the landscape looks like now. The University of Chicago excavations also examined neighborhoods of 3rd right through 1st millennia BCE houses on the southern end of the East Mound, so in Pennsylvania's Tablet Hill. In addition to more tablets from this area, the stratigraphic methods then used in the 1950s and 1960s allowed reconstruction of the houses from which the archives came, the neighborhoods in which these houses were arranged, and also things like pottery-type sequences that, although very imperfect and much adapted and adjusted since then, has proved still foundational for the dating of southern Mesopotamian material even today. Now, from 1972, research at Nippur was directed by Matt Gibson, who shifted focus away from the East Mound over to the West Mound to get away from all of these temples and all of these massive excavations of the University of Pennsylvania, and to excavate houses, administrative buildings, and the past environmental setting that enabled the city's long-term occupation. So from 1972 to 1990, the project worked in diverse contexts, including houses of the Sasanian to Islamic era, several different neighborhoods of the 3rd through 1st millennia BC, the city wall during the early and late 3rd millennium BC, and a palace of the Kassite period, and, of course, a temple to Ninurta and Gula, because it turns out that religious buildings are never really far away from you at Nippur. So these 1970s to 1980s excavations also collected significant data on past environmental changes, particularly aridity spikes and river shifts that occurred during the 2nd millennium BCE. And these environmental changes caused 2 near abandonments of the site in the early and late 2nd millennium BC, or the later Old Babylonian period and the end of the Kassite period. Then, after a long hiatus, basically from 1990 to 2018 for a variety of reasons, the Nippur project restarted with a focus on the Parthian and Sasanian occupation of the site under Abbas Alizadeh as director, only to be disrupted again by the COVID-19 crisis. Anyway, we hope that renewed research at Nippur will start in January of 2024. And the focus in that next phase of research will be on this past lived experience during the city's growth in the late 3rd and mid-2nd millennium BCE, which are 2 episodes of government-sponsored reorganization of the Nippur urban landscape. Now, the larger context for this work is the proposal that ancient and modern cities share a great deal in terms of their advantages and their challenges. And as an analogy, I'm showing you the growth of the built area of the city of Chicago between 1972 and 1997, so just 25 years, along with the corresponding reduction in natural areas and farmland outside and within the city. So this growth, as many of you may have actually lived through, had an enormous effect on the ways of life and employment opportunities of Chicago's citizens, on property prices, yes, on traffic routes, and on density of occupation. And some of these effects, scaled down, surely also occurred in the past. So the way people lived in the past, as in the present, illuminates attitudes to privacy and convenience. So these are neighborhoods of variously early 2nd millennium BCE Nippur, early 2nd millennium BCE Ur, and mid-3rd millennium BC Tel Asmar, which is up in the Diyala. And the tightly packed houses in Mesopotamian cities, like these, suggest a long-term preference by inhabitants for really tight, close neighborhoods. The shaded spaces that are provided by narrow streets and the comfortable, supportive communities that are created by proximity and familiar neighbors may have been factors in the choice to live in ways that may seem very crowded and awkward to us today. Residents also may have valued proximity to family, to work, and to places of worship over open spaces. And these preferences mean that Mesopotamian cities usually did not see urban sprawl like our own suburbs. So the 15-minute city, which is the goal of many modern urban planners, though not all, was the norm in the past. This really means a city in which things like shopping, work, education, basically all the other necessities of life can be acquired within a 15-minute walk of your home. So basically it's Paris. But what happens when then government-managed expansion and reorganization of the city occurs? How does this disrupt the lives of residents in both physical and social ways? So, what we have during the late 3rd millennium BC, Ur III period, is a new national government that's based at Ur, further down in southern Mesopotamia, and they develop this complicated, very, very complicated bureaucracy, and especially a very wide-reaching taxation system. And to offset the resentment that new taxes might bring, they also developed building programs at many of the major cities in southern Mesopotamia. So this program basically aimed at stabilizing the nation internally and at pleasing both the gods with new temples and the people via investment in their cities. So the first king of the Ur III dynasty, Ur-Nammu, who's shown to you right there, was depicted on a stele from Ur, carrying building tools in a basket to shift clay around over one shoulder. And he's really the initiator of most of these projects. Many of his projects were then finished by his successors, but they all basically had the same goals. So what happens at Nippur? At Nippur, the Ur III building program involved expansion of the Enlil temple and the Inanna temple, construction of the city wall, a bit later. And these projects also, they created employment opportunities at several levels. So things like making bricks and stacking bricks and feeding laborers and making and selling all the random things that laborers needed. Ongoing manual labor in terms of maintenance of building projects afterwards, plus working for temple estates. In addition, there are more administrator jobs once the institutions are established. So Nippur expanded. This was not necessarily a goal, but it absolutely expanded just because of larger numbers of people. And as we'll see, there are also corresponding changes within the city plan as well. The new taxation system also involved creation of this nearby site of Tel Dream, ancient Puzurish Dagan, which was established as a tax collection center. It's about 10 kilometers southeast of Nippur. And taxes, which are mainly collected as sheep, goats, and cattle at this particular location, were collected there before being redistributed to administrators or to the temples in Nippur and elsewhere. So this created even more jobs, more administrators, more scribes, plus all the people who are needed to herd animals around and organize fodder for them, and even people making dung cake fuel and so on. So Ur III Nippur seems like a real world of opportunity. Indeed, as I already mentioned, the city reaches its maximum size during the Ur III period. And one area that is first occupied in the Ur III period is this southern extension of the site. And it is a pretty simple equation to suppose that newly arrived people following job opportunities would have simply moved in there and created a sort of mixed neighborhood that would look very similar to the kinds of neighborhoods that exist on the site already. But it's not a simple equation of homogeneous city growth. So let's go back now and actually look at the temple expansions of the Ur III period. So the Enlil temple, right in the center, was expanded from this earlier temple of kind of unclear size to an absolutely massive complex. It has 2 courtyards, new ziggurat, presumably on top of the earlier temple, and a huge on-ground temple. Ultimately, this complex probably covered somewhere around 100 to 180 meters. Now, this Ur III version unfortunately destroyed or covered up any earlier versions of the temple, so it's impossible to say exactly how much larger the Ur III version is than its predecessors, but we can imagine some significant growth. At the same time, right adjacent to this, the Inanna temple of the Ur III period was expanded to approximately 6 times the size of its mid-early dynastic plan, so earlier in the 3rd millennium, also becoming much more regular, much more symmetrical. And although temples usually have some open space around their outer walls, these two huge expansions must have displaced residents of nearby houses. Further, when we go and look at Tablet Hill and the excavations in the neighborhood there, there's a suggestion that the neighborhoods also were changed at around the same time as the temple expansions. So the little irregular houses of the previous Akkadian period were replaced by larger and much more regular houses in the Ur III period. So it seems as if there's a displacement of residents from the area where the temples are expanding and displacement of Tablet Hill residents as well. So in this context, it makes perfect sense that the southern area of Nippur is occupied for the first time. So it's open, it's potentially unowned or at least unused space, and it's available for housing. Internally displaced residents would not have wanted to move very far in order to retain all their social and economic connections. But the southern extension is actually far larger than what would be needed for the number of displaced residents, or it seems likely. If it's up to about 30 hectares in addition, the area that's impacted by the temple expansions in this neighborhood reorganization would have been maybe half that, and this is an incredibly rough estimate. So there must have been other people moving into the southern extension, and as already suggested, new immigrants would be attracted by the employment opportunities. And without any prior connections to the city, the southern extension may have been their only option in terms of housing. So some new immigrants may have had social connections to existing residents and arrived via what's called chain migration, or individuals joining earlier immigrants from the same village or tribe or community. But empty space within the city to house such new immigrants would have been extremely limited. So what does this southern extension look like? Are we right in assuming that there's a mixture of displaced residents and new immigrants coming in? Does it end up covered with sort of mixed neighborhoods of all social classes, or are there then selected types of residents and types of housing? So, Matt Gibson's 1970s, 1980s excavations in the Ur III occupation does suggest that there were relatively small houses here. So, also there's no tablets and not a lot of luxury house contents in them. We need to do a lot more excavation in this area, and this is one of the areas that we'll be targeting, but it's probable that the displacement for this new building and neighborhood reorganization within the city would have really impacted the lower classes, working classes, and powerless sectors of society. Meanwhile, anyone who was an administrator or in the upper classes would have retained their property rights and their residence within the city itself. Meanwhile, newly arrived administrators could probably find housing in these reorganized neighborhoods on the main mound, but immigrant labor could not. So at the moment, the contextual framework of this internal displacement, mainly of poor or disenfranchised, and new immigration into this area by laborers and working classes, suggests this southern extension in the Ur III period is something like a banlieue, occupied by generally disenfranchised poor. But we need to do a lot more work to confirm this. So these houses, they date to the early Ur III period, the time of the temple expansions. They were ultimately actually covered by the city wall of Ibbi-Sin, who's the final king of the Ur III dynasty. So there's additional changes to the urban landscape within the Ur III period that we hope to examine. And coincidentally, after about 24 years of entirely successful rule, Ibbi-Sin's last days ended really quite badly. He lost territory to local rebellions, and Mesopotamia was then raided by the Elamites. So Ibbi-Sin was then captured and taken to ancient Anshan, an Elamite capital, together with a statue of the moon god from Ur. They were taken along as sort of captive booty. And ancient Anshan, of course, is modern Tal-e-Malyan, in Iran, which was excavated by Bill Sumner in 1971 to 1978. So there's another connection. But this is not the end of the story for the southern edge of Nippur. So after the collapse of the Ur III nation state, there's a much smaller Old Babylonian occupation on the site, but not in the southern extension at all. And by the mid-Old Babylonian period, around 1720 BC, the Euphrates River had basically shifted west, and the city was largely abandoned, essentially due to climate change. The Kassite period of the later second millennium BC is then the next period of interest. And after the climate recovered from this Old Babylonian collapse, there was a deliberate reoccupation that was organized by the Kassite government. Our evidence for this is this famous Kassite map of Nippur, which was the product of engineers or surveyors inspecting the city's ruins and marking areas of past or future use. And the Kassite kings, like the Ur III kings, organized specific building projects to rejuvenate the land, to legitimize their rule, and to gain the support of the people. And at Nippur, what they did was restored the Enlil and the Inanna temples, some other temples as well, built the city wall, essentially replicating the projects of the Ur-3 kings. But it was different. The Kassite kings were essentially rebuilding from scratch in an area of past ruins rather than reworking an existing site. So their building projects did not disrupt a really crowded city and displace residents to edge zones. They actually had to work hard to attract new residents to what was a largely empty, ruined city. So it's probable also that the population of the Kassite cities is significantly smaller than it would have been in the Ur-3 period, although the dense neighborhoods on Tablet Hill did refill, and ultimately the outlines of the city expanded to the same extent, the same 130 extent as in the Ur-3 period. But the interesting thing is, when we actually, again, look at what's happening in this southern extension, is in contrast to these possible houses of the poor and working classes in the Ur-3 period, the Kassite map suggests that in this area there is something which is called gardens in the city. So we can expect a different kind of occupant. And indeed, past excavations in this area do show that the area is occupied in the Kassite period after lying empty, and this is it. There's a contrast to the housing in the Ur-3 period. The Kassite houses in this area, again, this is Matt Gibson's work, were large and well planned, and this plan shows the level which is basically the initial reoccupation of this area in the late 14th or early 13th century BCE, initial occupation. So in this plan, you can see there's actually marked, there's two courtyards which indicate that this house has something like both private and semi-public, semi-private areas within it, and suggest this might be the house of an administrator who might be doing some official business from home. And I owe this interpretation to Richard Zettler. This use is also upheld by the presence of tablets and ceilings and a few seals, which suggests that these were also literate property-owning occupants, a huge contrast to the kind of people that were living in this area in the Ur-3 period. Now, some of these do actually come from slightly later pits of the first millennium BC that are dug into the houses, but their likely context is, in fact, immediately below. The tablets are mostly about legal issues and things like accounts of grain and wool and animals and sort of agro-pastoral resources that, again, reinforce the idea that these are land-owning, property-owning occupants. And speaking of pastoral resources, and again, reinforcing the differences between the Ur-3 and the Kassite occupations of this southern city edge, we know again from the 1970s excavations that there were significantly different ratios of bone counts and weights of sheep goats, which emerged together, pigs and cattle, as I hope you can see here. So by bone count, basically if you use pig as one and everything is then in relation to that, right? Pigs usually dominate in the Ur-3 context, and sheep and goats dominate in the Kassite context. But by weight, which is probably more significant, pigs still massively dominate in the Ur-3 period, but cattle dominate in the Kassite period. And now I'm looking at Gil and hoping that he's staying awake through this to actually sort of assess my statistics here. Right. Okay, so pigs are absolutely ubiquitous. They reproduce incredibly rapidly, and they're incredibly cheap to raise because they eat kitchen rubbish and anything that you don't want sitting around in the house. It makes them perfect animals for the poor. Meanwhile, cattle are incredibly slow to reproduce. They eat enormous amounts of grain for which they then compete with humans, and they're generally animals of the wealthy. So this difference in consumption then matches the theory that the Kassite houses in the southern extension were suburban homes of affluent officials, while the Ur-3 houses in the same area earlier were houses of the poor and disenfranchised. This contrast between the Ur-3 and Kassite occupations in the southern extension thus is plausible. Kassite suburban settlement may have been driven by aesthetic preferences and by the free choices of new administrators, while the Ur-3 Banlieue was created by the limited options of displaced or working class residents. There is, in fact, not a huge difference in house size, although the Ur-3 houses are somewhat smaller than the Kassite houses. But house size might reflect household size or number of occupants rather than wealth. And it's the contents of these houses in these periods, literate Kassites versus non-literate Ur-3 residents, for example, that underlines their different status. But we need further data in support, particularly more houses, to be sure that these are actually representative of the different occupations in this part of the site. Now, further, there are now actually a lot of new suites of archaeological science methods we can apply to these questions of status and household type. So pottery assemblages can now tell us a lot more than just dating, and we will be assessing these by household to reconstruct things like diet and foodways and to estimate household size and possible origins and status. We also hope to perform residue analysis on specific vessel types to extract information on things like cooking and foodways, as has recently been done by some colleagues on 4th millennium BCE material from the Diyala. And foodways are really a crucial aspect of cultural heritage, and different ways of cooking and eating, for instance, things like communal eating versus individual eating, can reflect very diverse kinds of communities. We're also going to dig in deeper into the archaeozoological remains to connect this taxation system that brought in animals from distant provinces to all the animals that are consumed at Nippur in the Ur-3 period in particular. So among the over 15,000 tablets from Tel Dreum are tablets like this that record the arrival of animals, particularly from the area of the Zagros Mountains. And this map then represents the Ur-3 state and the location of these eastern provinces. So texts record the arrival of literally tens of thousands of sheep and goats and a few other animals as well. But can we see the impact of these arrivals in the archaeological record? So did all the animals that arrived at Tel Dreum and Nippur trickle down from things like the governor's palace and the temples and into the diets of the inhabitants of the various neighborhoods at Nippur? So this will be one of our key questions. And one of our key methods to address this uses analysis of stable isotopes. So for those of you unfamiliar with this, basically all animals, including humans, absorb a range of chemical elements during your lifetimes from food and water, which are then deposited in various ways in your teeth and bones and can then be extracted and analyzed. So isotopes of carbon really can suggest food sources, while oxygen usually reflects water sources. So in the lower right, I've actually put some data. There'll be a little test later on this that show the diversity of the carbon and oxygen signatures among oxen from the early dynastic cemetery at Ur, which is an example of how this method and results actually work. So together, and there's a lot of diversity, basically that's the main thing to take away from the graph, is a huge amount of diversity in terms of things like herding patterns and herding locations. Together, when you put together the carbon and the oxygen isotopes, this can suggest possible locations that were used for pasture. So different kinds of, basically different kinds of water and different kinds of plant materials. So there's options in here, you maybe take my word for it, of oxen that were essentially pastured near marshes where there was a large area of open water, and they were eating probably young reed shoots because there's low water evaporation and a particular photosynthesis route for reeds. There's also some that may have been pastured at, on sort of smaller canals or canal ends or minor basins with grain fodder. So there was high evaporation of water and a different route for photosynthesis. Diversity of herding strategies is basically the point to take away. In addition, strontium isotopes are really the best proxy for the underlying geology of an animal's food and water intake. And this particularly can suggest whether a person or an animal has moved from one geologic zone to another. So circled in the graph on the left, a little red circle, is one of these oxen out of the same Ur cemetery sample that seems to have come from a slightly different region. All right. Well, the main problem with tracking movement of animals in the southern alluvium is that it has extremely homogeneous geology. So it's basically all inside this yellow area circled. So you could get a sheep that moves around hundreds and hundreds of kilometers within the zone, but their strontium signature will essentially be exactly the same over their lifespan. It won't show up. But the Zagros Mountains, to the east of this zone, are geologically different from the alluvium. They're also somewhat internally variable as well. So we do have a chance to match archaeological evidence with cuneiform documentation of this Ur-3 taxation system, and perhaps to identify animals that were raised in the area of modern Iran, who then ended up their lives on the table of the Ur-3 residents at Nippur. This is our hope. We're also likely to uncover human burials in both the Ur-3 and Kassite contexts, since below house floor burial was normal during these periods. So we're going to address things like the health and disease of the human population, particularly any contrast between the Ur-3 possible laborers and the Kassite possible administrators in terms of their diets, injuries, mortality rates, and so on, and especially their parasite load. So soil samples from the central part of burials can be analyzed for parasite eggs, which then offer data for things like diet, origins, and even profession or jobs, since some parasites are very strongly associated with things like canal digging or animal herding. You can see in here Schistosomiasis egg from our colleague Gil Stein's excavation at Tel Zaydan, a parasite which is associated with slow-moving water and perhaps with irrigation canal excavation. The whipworm egg from medieval Jerusalem also suggests a very, very particular diet. And I won't show you the actual parasites themselves, just the eggs, because it's pretty bad. Anyway, isotope analysis can also be performed on human remains for the same aims as for animals, to examine diet and to examine mobility. But rather than herding strategies, human diet can suggest things like status and wealth. So foodways, preferences, ways of eating, which are strongly associated with ethnicity and national origin. So things like fish have been recovered in both Ur-3 and Kassite contexts in the southern extension at Nippur, but they don't preserve particularly well in the archaeological record. The bones are simply too fragile. So the percentage of fish in the diets of Nippur's residents is probably massively underrepresented in the faunal remains. But a diet that's very high in fish protein can be reflected in human isotopes. And my guess is that fishing in canals and in the river might have been an important supplement to the diets of the Ur-3 residents in particular, and we hope to test this further, as well as things like gender differences in diet and more. We're also planning to launch an archaeobotanic project to support these isotope studies of humans and animals and their diets, and we will be completely unsurprised if things like barley and wheat are the main crops. But there are also additional, more interesting questions about redistribution versus household harvesting that might be reflected in things like the cleaning process of grain and in species ratios, and particularly things like the percentages of weeds versus cash crops and so on, and actual sort of seeds, may allow us to reconstruct the intensity of farming. And particularly the Ur-3 farming regime is assumed to be quite intensive, with limited fallowing to match these high taxation demands of the national government. So can we see this in terms of the types of seeds and their proportions? And finally, fuel is a huge and under-documented but absolutely crucial resource for all urban centers that we tend to not incorporate into our thinking in terms of the labor and time that is expended in simply gathering fuel for daily life and for industry and so on. So we hope to examine what fuel was available in Nippur's catchment zone, and there are some Ur-3 texts that suggest that there were tree groves nearby that didn't last very long, as well as looking at things like contrast between the houses. So are there luxury fuels and poor people's fuels? And as examples, this image actually shows some of the common fuels in southern Mesopotamia. So there's modern animal dung cakes on the left and the date pits that were used for kiln fuel at the site of Lagash, where I've been working recently. And diverse fuel sources like this really support the sustainability of urban life. And finally, we're going to address the tricky issue of Nippur's city wall over time, as the Ur-3 and Kassite occupations both raise questions of how new urban space was integrated and outlined and defined. So there's a frequent statement in general and in specialist literature that the early dynastic period cities of southern Mesopotamia were in constant conflict with each other, this constant state of warfare. The very rich evidence for cultural exchange and trading really belies this, but there were occasional conflicts, and city walls in the early dynastic period were in fact common. And they seem to fall into two main models. There's walls that completely surround the entire city, or walls that actually simply incorporate individual sectors within that. Now, it's not yet clear into which model Nippur falls, although there are some very clear stretches of city wall, particularly on the eastern side, and I hope you can see these kind of linear features on the east. So Uruk, down in further south in southern Mesopotamia, is a perfect example of this sort of full-walled city. The walls are actually still visible on the surface, and they've been reified by magnetic resonance and excavation as essentially being sort of entirely surrounding the entire mound. But Lagash, which is further south, also near Ur, appears to have this second model with several individual internal walled sectors that were divided by water channels or streets, as revealed by my UPenn colleague Emily Hammer, who also should be well known to you all from her time here in University of Chicago, who explored this through magnetometry and drone image interpretation. So this multiple walled sector model might have to do with sequence of city expansion or other kinds of social differences. It's useful to note that at Lagash also there's an entire north sector that at the moment actually appears to be unwalled, that again there needs to be more work to confirm this. So moving back to Nippur, the early dynastic wall was examined in a few places by UPenn in the 1890s. And here's the excavations right at the sort of northeast edge of the city with the characteristic dumps on each side for the time, making it look like a big centipede. And a cross-section through this wall suggests there was an early dynastic original construction, as one would hope, with Akkadian and then Ur-III reconstructions and repairs on top of that. So their methods were not perfect, but the dating to early dynastic Naram Sin of the Akkadian period by stamped bricks, and then the Ur-III period, which is written here as Ur-Gur, which is now Ur-Nammu. This all seems fine. And this map, again, of the 1890 excavations shows the areas of the wall that the UPenn excavated, the UPenn team excavated. So this is mounds, they're in Roman numerals, 11, 7, and 12. Right. So looking at all of these, it looks as if we have a potential, either one of these two models. There could be the sort of Uruk model where the city wall encloses the entire thing, or potentially there's two individual sectors that are on either side of the Chateau Neil in the center. And it's the wall that's on the west side of the Chateau Neil in Mound X, which is down in the bottom left part, that is a bit more intriguing. The date on this is actually completely uncertain, and the construction in that area didn't match any of the styles in the cross-section that they excavated in the northeast side of the mound. There's actually some speculation that it might be a terrace for an early dynastic palace or something else. And while there's evidence for a riverside, there's no evidence for a riverside wall on the eastern side. There is this possible little turn to the north on the other one, the west side, right. This is a rather unhelpful photograph of the excavation in this area, just so you can see again what we're sort of up against, right. But it actually seems pretty unlikely that this little sort of turn to the north, this just simply doesn't make any sense in terms of moving through and then surrounding the West Mound. If you cut off urban residents' river access, this is incredibly illogical in the past and in the deep past and in the ancient past. Essentially based on things like this. So we have a whole lot of different images here of riverbank use in the late 1800s to early 1900s in places like Mosul and Hilla, various cities within Iraq. And based on this, and also our sort of knowledge of how Mesopotamian cities worked in the past, it's probably along the riverbank that the market was, where households went to fetch water and all this fuel that they need. Also, the riverbank is used to process wool for textiles, which are Mesopotamia's most massive industry and export, and to wash clothing, and for all these sort of practical but undocumented jobs that actually make urban living possible and underpinned the Mesopotamian economy. So where is the early dynastic city wall at Nippur? Right. So these are the options. Was it around just the east mound with an unwalled western side, like the northern unwalled area at Lagash? Or is the full high mound actually walled with water gates or something for the river to flow through on the model of Uruk? Or were there two walled sectors like the southern part of Lagash? So another area that we're going to target for excavation, and I may regret this, is going to be the southeast edge of the eastern mound in this area, which was tested by UPenn, if we can avoid their spoil heaps and some of the trapped dunes that are still in this area. And this excavation should allow us to begin to think about the nature of interactions between the city and urban edge zones and ex-urban areas in terms of integration or separation for economic and ideological reasons. So to sum up, Nippur has many, many opportunities as well as challenges, and this density of previous excavations needs very careful management, but at least means that we have huge prior knowledge about the city's occupation history and can therefore ask detailed questions about the challenges of city living at particular times. And I just want to close by reflecting on the social context of work and research at Nippur in terms of threats to the site and also ways of crossing the divide between academic research and the lived experience of nearby residents. So issues of urban growth have modern connections, particularly given the rapid pace of development in Iraq today. So Affluent, which is the nearest town to Nippur, has grown from a village to a small city that seems to derive its wealth from being on a main road and offering things like car repairs and fruit stalls and cigarettes to people passing through. But the population density of the wider region has also grown rapidly. So this is 1965 to 1987. And this is 2018, with further numbers specifically on the growth of Affluent particularly. So what are the effects of this sprawl on Nippur? Well, new construction in Affluent has not yet reached the site, but it is inching down the paved road towards it, and we should prepare for when it does. There are also more tourists on the site, but there's very little information to support visits. So most of the tourists, they go to the ziggurat, and this is Iraqi tourists, foreign tourists. It's also Yana Matishak and I the other day, back last month. So they go to the ziggurat, they climb up it, and they tend to leave again. And the erosion from this climbing is absolutely damaging the ziggurat. But it's hard to say that this should be forbidden. And here I absolutely am including myself and my colleagues, and we climbed up the ziggurat on a trip back in March. So how do we enable this engagement, but also preserve the archaeological record and impart useful information about the importance of the site in the past as the cultural heritage of modern Iraqis? Now, another thing is that the ziggurat is currently topped by this house of John Henry Haynes, who is the director of the University of Pennsylvania project in the 1890s. In fact, it's hard to imagine the ziggurat without it. It helps to preserve the ziggurat from erosion to an extent, and it has now been part of the Nippur landscape for over 125 years, in fact, longer than the reign of the Ur III dynasty. So most people would argue that it should be conserved as part of the long-going biography of the site. However, to some Iraqis, this is a symbol of Western appropriation of Iraqi cultural heritage and the dominance of a research agenda over their experiences. So the current temporary exhibit in the ISAC Museum by Hannah Malala and colleagues tackles this tension between Iraqi desires for engagement with archaeological sites and the priorities of Western scholars. So we need to find ways to move forward together. Thank you very much.